Sage is perfect, Sage is beautiful, Sage is a model, Sage could walk out on the runway in a diaper, and I'd be like, Sage, your smile is beautiful. With the Savage raid tier coming out in a few days, and with me finally able to really thoroughly sit down and test out the Sage, I am ready to do a more fleshed out impressions video, which will at times greatly humble me, because I'm gonna be quite honest about some things, but hopefully will help people with wondering what's up with it. And by thoroughly tested, I do mean that I have literally gone into Party Finder as a healer with a full pugged set of group and then managed purple parses now, and so with that being done, I finally feel like I can talk about the Sage, because trust me, I have now been through the paces. So first up, let's get out my general thoughts on the Sage. And I really do love the Sage. That is not me just hype training it, it's not me just following a bias or something like that. Playing it and putting it through its paces, it is by far one of the best healers I have ever played in any game. Its toolkit is extremely rewarding when you're familiar at all with a particular engagement and can recognize key points to interject with powerful abilities of your kit. I want to go over some examples to highlight what I mean when I say that. So first up is a well-placed Panheima, for instance, is absolutely mind-blowingly powerful. I cannot emphasize how strong that is. Another one is a well-timed Zoe with Numa combo is staggeringly strong. That is a huge burst. Like, people can be really low, like 20% health or something, and it's just boom, up there. It's crazy. Now next up is Tar Colt, both burst heal and then provide an ongoing 10% mitigation to the tank or party member, like if they're targeted with like a theoretical like spam damage like a DPS. I don't know, we'll have to see the Savage mechanics, but my point is that 10% mitigation with that burst heal ahead of time feels really good when executed properly. Even more so when you pair it up with Haima, because that 10% will make Haima last even longer. Even Holos with the small heal with the 10% damage reduction stacks with the other reductions for 20% reduction, which is something I felt keenly on fights like Hydaelyn Extreme's ad phase, where the tanks are being honestly mercilessly whacked into the ground. This is another place where Panheima applied to both tanks is intensely good. You're thinking, Panheima, that's the group AoE skill. Well, you know what? You're getting it on both tanks, and that feels so good. It's like the most decadent barrier skill I have ever thought of. Now another one is when you throw Krasis into the mix that buffs abilities like Haima or Cardia. So note, it's not just magic skills, so spells. It is actually abilities as well with Krasis, which is just crazy. It's ridiculous. But this, how to say, Krasis is so strong with that 20% healing amplification that even Dark Knight's Living Dead being able to be resolved easily between a Sage or Ast. I've seen it myself. It's very powerful, as in no benediction needed. But take a simple thing like Cardia at 170 potency, which is very obvious. Of course it's 170 potency, haha. Now Krasis. Put on Krasis on that target for 20% on that, which is going to be a 204 potency per proc, which is very, very good. But now add on Soteria, adding another 50% on top of that, so you're getting 170 multiplied by 1.5 multiplied by 1.2 is 306 potency of healing per tick. Which this combo, and remember that it's not at a normal heal over time tick cadence, it's going to be at whatever your GCD is, which roughly, I know that this is probably not optimal, but I am aiming mostly for like a 2.5, just because I'm gonna really be putting a lot into crit, a lot into determination, mostly myself. I don't think I'm gonna go heavy into spell speed, but my point is normal heal over time tick cadence is 3 seconds. We're looking at least 2.5, so baseline, you're just getting a lot of power from this. It makes some of the roughest dungeon pulls very trivial. It makes mishandled tank busters very manageable to recover from. But now I've gone on and on and on with examples. This is why I say what I do though, these kinds of example lists, and there's more, but reeling myself back at this point, my point is that the Sage is stunningly powerful when its kit is being really hinged correctly, and there are way more powerful interactions than just these listed here. But the Sage also has the power of control in aspects of their kit, like Cardio is something that they fully get to choose where it goes and when, meaning something like many Scholar players have wanted for a very long time, since chip damage resolution on a DPS, like if your fairy's just randomly healing a DPS when you want it to heal the tank, you don't need to worry about that, especially because usually in most instances, but just because of people are going to wonder why I don't want that, is usually chip damage on DPS is going to be resolved passively through like AoE effects like Sacred Soil, Caracol, what have you. So you don't usually want it on the DPS, you want that healing funneled directly into the tank. But here's where we get to the unfortunate turnaround. With that responsibility of control comes the responsibility over it. If you aren't willing to swap targets to resolve chip damage across the party when it is actually needed, you might be throwing cardio procs at a tank that's not taking damage, and that's a waste. That's the definition of overheal. And just based off of current content fights, so in that context, we already know that a lot of these targets are stopping their auto attacks on the tank when they're performing a cast. And so this is not just a theoretical thing, we are actually seeing it when we're looking at extreme trials. So where a fairy would automatically shift targets, now that responsibility is on you, and I've seen some Sage players that even refuse to shift during or after a tank swap. I personally attribute these failures to swap cardio targets due to cognitive overload during a fight, where there is just so much during that fight to keep track of that swapping cardio just isn't on the forefront of their mind. That's why I note what I do note here. Don't presume quote-unquote change cardio targets is something that you need like an IQ of 9001 to do that, and yes, that is over 9000. Respectfully, there are no concepts in this game or generally gaming in general that requires a 9001 IQ. But the problem is, in the heat of battle, for many people, that is not going to be super imperative. That's not going to be on the forefront of their mind, as they're like dodging light waves that are bursting everywhere. A lot of people could have sensory overload when it comes to doing the mechanics, contributing DPS as a healer, contributing the heals, and making sure that you cannot time revive off. And now all of a sudden you have yet another mechanic on top of that to worry about. And that's what I'm getting at here. Not that I think that this is beyond anyone, because it's absolutely not, but it's just another thing to keep track of. Now let's go over general quality of life things that I appreciate on the Sage when actually playing it through these weeks. So first up is Caracol is a buff that is applied to allies in a range around you that reduces incoming damage and applies a great heal over time effect. I love that it is applied to targets and allows them to move around rather than forced to be in Sacred Soil, or alternatively not in Sacred Soil, not get the perks. Such as I can put this on both of the tanks during the Highland Extremes ad phase and not worry about them moving outside of Sacred Soil, which it is their job to shift crystal to crystal to make sure that the team can progress. On a Sage, I don't need to worry about that. I just apply it to them as they move, it stays on them. Next up is the separation between Haima and Panhaima, the single target versus the AoE, quote-unquote AoE one. I like being able to stagger them, and even Panhaima, the so-called AoE barrier regen, is fantastic on single target. It's a powerful tool that even at 200 potency is still a huge amount of barriers, not to mention that you can stack Haima and Panhaima for replenishing 500 potency of barriers, which is disgusting. Even more so when you add the 20% from Krasis, so now that's 600 potency refreshing barriers for 6 times in a row. I genuinely don't think we're going to see a use case for that much barriers outside of Ultimate, but that is an option that we do have. It's a bizarre option, but it's one that we do have as a Sage. Another thing that I like is the theory behind Tarkol being a 10% mitigation. I say theory because I really haven't seen anything that needs this much mitigation yet, at least. But in a world where tanks pull wall to wall, that 10% does go way further than a few hundred potency heal. So I have used it like in dungeons, but in trials I haven't really seen that. But in a world where we might theoretically see tank busters spike a tank's health below 1, being able to prevent damage rather than burst it up through something like Scholar's Excogitation ability makes me very pleased. Other things is Soteria not needing a build up feels intensely good. Having a charge of Addersgall comes up every 20 seconds feels great. Really, really great. Actually, I rarely feel totally out of gas unless my co-healer is literally falling over and or opting to not heal. Now let's talk about things that I don't like about the Sage, which I might actually be doing a follow-up video when the Savage Raids are released on this, because this is actually a huge issue for me, or a few of these are a huge issue for me. So first up, and most at the forefront of my mind, even before like I consider anything else, is I want an Addersgall spender that isn't healing. I don't want to spam Drill Coal anymore. Right now, to restore MP and keep MP reserves up, you have to throw out your spenders, like Drill Coal. So otherwise, you're basically like wasting the charge, not getting your MP back, and your MP is going to suffer a little bit. I am not a fan of this because often it's just wasted healing. It's just pointless overhealing just so I can get MP back. I could use it on Tarkol, but that's on a 45-second cooldown that I might want elsewhere. Same deal with Caracol. Well, yes, I argue, and I will stand by that argument, that it is almost always worth casting Sacred Soil, Caracol. When no damage is coming in, it is going to be a wasted cast, and a wasted cast is a wasted cast, and the question then becomes, why apply it during 15 seconds of basically downtime to keep it on cooldown when the AoE comes out later? Like, it doesn't make sense. So I've thrown out Drokol. Basically the point of this is we need a spender, please, even if it is just a spammable damage reduction or like an energy drain equivalent. I don't know. This could be the scholar in me speaking, but it has been like, well, that's just aimless overheal just so I can get MP. And then people could be like, the MP's its own reward, but I feel bad right now. It just feels bad. I mean, yeah, feely craft, whatever, but that's definitely what my play experience has been like. Secondly, I really despise Pepsis being on 30-second cooldown. I kind of understand why, because we can like cast barriers on the fly, blah blah blah. Like there is, I can see why, but this is likely because I'm used to, or why this personally impacts me so much is because over the years I'm used to Scholar's emergency tactics on like 15-second, but this aims more towards, as I said, the bias of mine for Scholar developed over the years, so I'm not used to having an alternative spammable button called Prognosis, or an absolutely nutty ability called Pneuma, which becomes even more crazy with Zoe. But actually, this shifts to another point of contention I should bring up here. Specifically, when I talk to a lot of people, people say that Sage lacks AoE burst healing, and my answer to that is absolutely no, that is not true, because while Scholar has Excog Indom, Sage has Zoe Pneuma, as well as we have our own Indom ourselves called Ixochol. Where Scholar has Fey Blessing, we have a simply more powerful baseline heal over time in Fizzes than Whispering Dawn. Whispering Dawn is a quoted 80 potency, Fizzes is much higher than that. Not to mention Sage gets absolutely mind-blowing 60-second cooldown, 10% healing buff to the entire party, making their synergy with any co-healer in a raid scenario ridiculous, because that buff really goes far. If you're thinking about like the most painful pain points, that 10% mitigation, additional healing will really carry. So while I could feign concern over this and maybe like garner a lot of views by overhyping, oh my god, Sage is doomed, that's not how I feel taking Sage into the content through pugs. You don't get much harder than with a different co-healer every time you try and do something. But I digress, we're going off on a tangent here that is far better in a Sage versus Scholar update video. I'm gonna move on from here. Lastly, I want to end this video on things I noticed about the Sage so far that surprised me. So first up is the amount of times that I get Toxicon procs is obscenely low, and I've said it before many times on this channel, and I will retain that stance, is that if your tank isn't gonna die to Tank Buster, then there's no reason to cast on the GCD your big single target barrier, which would be Eucration Diagnosis for the Sage. With the Sage especially, I found Krasis with Haima very effective. It's going to be a 360 upfront barrier that repeats 5 more times after, basically making successive damage like auto attacks from boss non-existent. And then when I have my boyfriend who's playing White Mage, reducing impact with Divine Benison with that 500 potency instant off GCD barrier, and then an off GCD 15% damage reduction through Aquaveil, it becomes very difficult when I am paired with him to see any tank busters whatsoever. Of course though, that's not even including like Taracol into the mix for another 10% reduction, which I could also do off the GCD, which I'd prefer over GCD casting for barrier. I'm going to be very surprised if Savage requires such a voracious amount of padding and mitigation. I do expect it in Ultimate, but in Savage, I would be dramatically shocked if even the second phase of the final boss, whatever that is, we have no idea what it is at this point, if it requires even that much. That is a lot. Now the second thing that surprised me, and this is my Scholar bias coming out again. I said at the start of this video I'd humble myself, and I'm being really honest with you. My Scholar bias really made this actually surprise me, is mobility and contributing damage while being mobile does not feel like an issue with the Sage. And this is coming from me with a spammable Ruin 2 on the cast instant while moving. Pneuma is ideally used during a raid buff window. Phlegma. Phlegma is sorry. But my point is, I get it. 100% on board with the theory that I laid out myself about putting all of your Phlegma casts into the raid buff window. But there are many times where I have found it ideal to use Phlegma instead as enhanced mobility just to ensure that I don't stop casting. After all, it isn't a loss of 330 potency, or rather, isn't a loss of 330 potency just because you had to like completely stop casting to move out of like a proximity AoE or something like that. higher than the theoretical value that you can get from raid buffs. Again, that is going to be very team comp dependent as well. What if you have a black mage, a samurai, a white mage? Like, you need to consider these things. Those aren't going to be buffing your damage. But in general, even if you did have like a dragoon and all that, I'd in general rather not drop a cast when pushed, because remember, you're also going to be losing a cardio proc at that time. I've gone way too deep on that. That is a video topic in and of itself, probably. But my point is, combine Phlegma with slide casting, with the mobility ability Icarus, which is absolutely insane, and my own worries about Scholar getting a spammable Ruin 2 are peace and love, null and void. I literally don't care. Especially when you get used to the mobility ability, like the Icarus, when you get used to it, which is, I'm still trying on that. I said that I'd be humble and like reveal the truth. I'm needing like at least a few more months to get used to having a healer with this ability. But the point I'm trying to make is, when you get used to it, it opens up some quote-unquote very risky gameplay with literally every other healer that you can pull off as a sage, which is so cheeky when you get used to it. I have done some degenerate things. Now, talking about surprises, another thing that surprised the heck out of me is how good on the cast with movement of barriers feels. Now hear me out before you say, oh, that's the exact same as Sakor, even though Sakor has a cast time. Not quite. I want to do Dragon Song War Ultimate Progression, and that means a lot of extra padding and defense and mobility is needed. Especially as a healer, I need to change my mindset from doing damage, from doing mechanics and contributing as much DPS, to making sure that we just see mechanics. So, and that I'm doing the mechanics properly at the same time, and especially during progression. We're not talking about, oh, I've seen T 90 times. It's like, okay, you're seeing T for the first time. You're seeing all of the like phase transitions, and then you're seeing like Wormhole or whatever for the first time, or Interdimensional. My brain right now is just full of sage skills, not raid mechanic names. You know what I mean. But for me personally, my point is, I see on the fly emergency barriers while moving, while rushing, while I'm going in a panic, going, oh my god, I need to move to this side of the arena, as a huge perk. I can adjust and resolve area of effect damage and prevent area of effect damage, or pad it as I resolve my own positioning. I already have seen myself do this when I'm doing like Highland and like in a panic, and I'm like, oh my god, in the most hilarious way possible. This is a huge flag of why I would pick Sage over Scholar. It's just being able to freely, no reins, no frills, no strings attached, deploy barriers. And as a healer, when I need to choose between Ruin 2, which is on the fly casting of damage, versus on the casting barriers, as a healer, which one do you think I prefer when push comes to shove? Now, the last thing that surprised me was how good Krasis feels. A lot of people were memeing on it, saying, oh, it's the worst of the healer cooldowns. I actually disagree completely. People say seeing is believing, and I believe, after playing it with it for weeks, 100% back my feelings on this. Krasis is a very powerful game changer, and it's on a 60-second cooldown, and it impacts all forms of healing. It impacts all healing with 20% increase, which makes Cardia better, which makes Haima better, which makes Panheim on a single target better. I don't think I care about using it to make my like single target Eucration diagnosis barrier bigger, which is what a lot of people said you'd want it for. Maybe in Ultimate when I'll want that, but like I said before, I barely cast Eucration diagnosis. I even now, without casting it, I barely see tanks HP drop below 80% when I'm paired with my co-healer boyfriend. It's very rare that I see that. But I view it almost like the old Fairy Rouse ability from way back in the day. I'm aging myself a lot by saying that, but I've been playing this game for way too long. But it's just more of a slight uptick on what you are going to be outputting that you can depend on. Few things feel much as a Chad-like ability as a 360 self-refreshing Haima barrier because of Krasis. Krasis with Haima is another 360 potency over all of barriers just because you did Krasis before it. But to close off this video, it's going to be the same way as I started. Sage is perfect, Sage is beautiful. Sage is a model. Sage could walk out on the runway in a diaper and I'd be like, Sage, your smile is beautiful.